What is up, addicts? Welcome to the Fantasy Addiction Network. In this stream, we're going to be going over all of the early games on the Sunday slate and talking through the best start and sits across those early games. Actually, have a pretty nice spread here where we have, 8 games in the morning, 5 games in the afternoon, 1 at night, and then 1 on Monday night. Finally, kind of have like a little bit of a disparity. We can actually try to pay attention to all the games in the morning because there's not like 11 going on. There's only 8, and then there's 5 in the afternoon. Really wish they would do more of that even split going forward, but we'll take it for 1 week. Now, quickly recapping the Thursday night game, that did not go anywhere as planned for the Jaguars. Gardner Minshew looked absolutely awful tonight, and that was, I guess the biggest fail on our part was neglecting how much he needed DJ Chark. Now, DJ Chark had not received too many targets up to this point, but apparently just being on the field and having that deep downfield presence, that big-bodied receiver, really helped create a lot of space for the other receivers there. So Keelan Cole, bit of a bust tonight. Looked like he was going to get some garbage time. He gets knocked out of the game. James Robinson, the only bright spot for the Jaguars tonight, absolutely crushed it. Over 30 points in PPR. Love it. Love to see it. Dolphins, on the other hand, had a good game, but no one really did much for you for fantasy other than Ryan Fitzpatrick, which I doubt many people started outside of 2 quarterback leagues, but it was still a really good streaming option. 2 touchdowns through the air, 1 on the ground, and Devontae Parker had an okay game, decent amount of yards there, but no touchdowns. Mike Gesicki had 1 catch, but it was for a touchdown, so he at least bailed you out there. So Myles Gaskin had a pretty decent game. If you had started him, I think he scored about 15 points in PPR, so good game. Could have been a lot more fantasy points. Dolphins didn't really have to do too much. They let off the gas pretty early on, and other than James Robinson on the Jaguars, are pretty disappointed. So we'll keep that in mind going forward. But anyway, let's talk about the rest of the games going on this week. Obviously, a lot of very interesting games on the slate here, and a lot of garbage once again, too. Like, this was the same thing that we had last week. It makes things a little bit easier for DFS in terms of trying to identify the games that could potentially go off. We had a few good games on the slate last week with a high over-under, whereas this week, pretty much the same thing. We've got a few games where there's, a lot of fantasy players going, and for the most part, it's going to be kind of a mess, but that makes it a little bit easier for us to decide who the best starts and sits are. Obviously, there's always going to be people that we miss on, like we would love to be perfect. I'd love to be able to go into the future and grab the stat line and the box score and come back and give it to you guys, but obviously that wouldn't make it very fun now, would it? So let's go through it and we'll analyze each of these games piece by piece, give you guys the best starts and sits on the week. We'll begin, I'm at the end of my slideshow. That's what we get for testing it beforehand. All right, let's jump over and we will begin by talking about the San Francisco 49ers and the New York Giants. Now, 49ers are completely decimated on defense, completely decimated on offense as well, whereas the Giants also lost a good bit of their offense with Saquon Barkley going down, Sterling Shepard on IR with turf toe. So this is going to be a bit of a banged up game between both of these teams. 49ers lost a lot of pieces on defense. It's looking like Jimmy Garoppolo is not going to play this week. Raheem Mostert's most likely out. Tevin Coleman is already ruled out. George Kittle is still up in the air. So a lot of big name players that you drafted, and they're not going to be here in this game. Obviously, Saquon Barkley done for the season. So going to be interesting to try to analyze this going forward. The 49ers defense had been pretty decent up to this point, stopping the run, stopping the tight ends. Not that they faced any notable tight ends up to this point. Dan Arnold in week 1 and last week, Chris Herndon blocked for like 99% of his work. So, haven't really seen yet whether that's something that's going to continue. I don't think that's going to really weigh too much on how I feel about Evan Ingram this week. 49ers 10th in points allowed for the receiver. So a little bit more points going there, but a lot of that came from DeAndre Hopkins in week 1. So, yeah, in terms of what we expect from this game, I think the 49ers can still control this one pretty well, even with the injuries that they've sustained, but it's, a low over under 41.5. We've got the 49ers winning by 4 according to the Vegas spread, so that gives us roughly 23-19. Very low over under in this one, not going to be a lot of fantasy options. So In terms of who we would start, well, we'll begin with the 49ers. Jerick McKinnon is a wonderful play this week. Most likely going to be missing both Mostert and Tevin Coleman. I know Tevin Coleman's already rolled out. Mostert is pretty much out. Like we're just waiting for the official confirmation, but I would not bet that they would throw Mostert back out there, especially on the same field that he got hurt on. They were complaining about the turf last week. So Jerick McKinnon is a fantastic play. He has looked great up to this point. My biggest fear with him is the fact that Jeff Wilson will probably steal some goal line carries, but I think Jerick McKinnon definitely has the opportunity to do similar to what Raheem Mostert has been doing and just break free on some long runs. He should be involved in the passing game, and he's one of the few playmakers that they have at this point. So Jerick McKinnon should be started, especially in PPR and half PPR formats. Now, on the tight end department, Jordan Reed remains a really good play. The Giants not the greatest against the tight end, but if Kittle plays, then I don't think you can play Reed. Obviously, if they feel comfortable enough putting Kittle back out there on this field, they must feel pretty good in his health. So monitor the practice situation. Kittle has not practiced all week. We haven't really heard yet, but they did rule Kittle out pretty early last week when they did rule him out. So hopefully we'll find out pretty early on if Kittle is going to play or not. So I'll play the guy that's healthy. If Kittle is there, I'm playing him. If Kittle is out, I'll play Reed. And of course, 49ers defense, pretty good play this week against a decimated Giants team. Jeff Wilson, as I mentioned, is probably going to be someone that will steal a few goal line carries, but I don't think he's going to get enough work to really be worth it. And then we're not going to be starting Nick Mullins or Brandon Ayuk or Kendrick Bourne until we kind of know like what this team looks like. Nick Mullins was able to support George Kittle a few years ago, but never really had a dominant receiver there. So until Deebo Samuel comes back, this is just kind of a mess of a situation for the 49ers. On the Giants side, pretty easy for me. Darius Slayton is the lone beneficiary here of Sterling Shepard going out. Darius Slayton, in all of his games that he had performed really well, it was on the on behalf of either Golden Tate or Evan Ingram or Sterling Shepard being hurt. Well, now both Saquon Barkley and Sterling Shepard are gone, so Darius Slayton is going to see a lot more looks, and that is typically a recipe for success there. We already know that the 49ers are capable of giving up a decent amount of points to the receivers. Obviously, we also have Richard Sherman on IR. This team is just beat up. So if the Giants are going to score any points, it's probably going to be done through Slayton and Evan Ingram. Now, Golden Tate, maybe you can convince me to start him, but I didn't see a lot from him last week that got me too excited. So if I'm going to play guys in this game with a low over-under, I'm going to play ones that have the potential to have a really good week in scoring touchdowns, and I think Slayton and Ingram are the only guys that really give that to you. Dion Lewis is interesting, but I probably would try to find a better option if you're like up against it. I think Dion Lewis is an okay play, could have like 5 or 6 receptions this week, but we don't know what Devonta Freeman's role is going to be. Maybe they'll use Wayne Gallman a little bit. Probably going to try to avoid this running back situation for a while. Daniel Jones, not someone we want to start against the 49ers in a low over-under on this week. Even if the Giants win, most likely it's not going to be because they scored a lot of points. So I'm going to try to be avoiding the majority of the options here. We have the 49ers still winning this one pretty handily. The Giants just have not looked good or cohesive as a whole. Their offensive line has been terrible. Daniel Jones have been playing okay, but kind of hard to throw behind that offensive line. Losing Saquon Barkley really deflates a lot of the gas in this offense. So we have the 49ers beating the Giants by 10 in this one, 24-14. All right, and jumping over and talking about the Washington football team and the Cleveland Browns, another very intriguing but not very exciting game on the slate. Maybe for just determining what these two teams are going to look like the rest of the way. But Washington versus Cleveland, going to be very interesting to see if who's the real deal here in terms of what quarterback can end up performing. Baker Mayfield had a nice rebound week in week 2, whereas Dwayne Haskins still just really looked bad last week against the Cardinals. So over under again, kind of low, 45. Browns are actually given a 7-point spread here, which is intriguing. I don't really know that I buy into that. Vegas obviously favors the Browns here, but I mean, Washington, while they got blown out by the Cardinals, I mean, they beat the Eagles, and the Browns aren't exactly the most imposing team either. We know that the way to get Baker Mayfield to play poorly is to pressure him a lot. And Washington arguably has one of the best, if not the best, defensive lines in the NFL, being able to create a lot of pressure. They did give up a lot of points to Kyler Murray, but that was more through his ability to run the ball. And I'm worried for Baker Mayfield in this one. If he gets pressured, he gets hit a lot, we could see him start making a good bit of mistakes. So Washington also very good against the run. This is a very run-heavy team with Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. So something's got to give here between what Washington has done up to this point and what the Cleveland Browns want to do. This game is at home. Looks like their offensive line is going to be healthy. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Browns were able to just steamroll Washington in this one, but I don't necessarily predict that that's what's going to happen. In terms of who we would start in this one, I mean, Antonio Gibson has looked really good. He's started to already see a really high uptick in his overall touches. Last week, he doubled his touches from the week before, and I really like Gibson a lot this week. The Browns, didn't give up too many points to Joe Mixon, but we saw, J.K. Dobbins be able to run on them. So Antonio Gibson also more of a threat in the passing game. So if you're going to throw a running back from Washington out there, I definitely think Antonio Gibson is a top 24 play this week. Terry McLaurin, after blowing up last week, it's kind of hard to ignore that. And then the Browns are the worst team against the tight end right now, and they were the second worst team against the tight end last year. They give up second most points to tight ends, and that makes Logan Thomas a very interesting play here. Not someone that you would think would end up being someone you want to jam into your lineup, but we saw the Browns last week struggle against CJ Uzomah and Sample. So if those guys can do it, I think Logan Thomas, who's still seeing over a 20% target share on his team, definitely has a chance at being a really good play this week. And I really like Washington's defense. I think they'll be able to force a couple turnovers from Baker Mayfield, get some sacks in this one. So I think they're a good defensive play. We're not playing anyone else on Washington, just to be clear. We're going to stick with the only guys that have legitimate upside here. Haskins is out for me. McKissick and Barber are ceding way too much work to Gibson already. And then Steven Sims just hasn't been what we hoped for, so I'm not throwing him out there. On the Browns side, I mean, we know that this is a tough running back matchup for them, which is rough for sure. But overall, you still got to start Chubb and Hunt. Each week that their ceiling is absolutely massive. This game is at home, and they could surprise and just come out there and be dominant. So I'm not going to talk myself out of benching either of them, but I am lowering my expectations just a bit. Not expecting Chubb to have the kind of monstrous output that he had last week, but hopefully he can at least still get a score in and get enough carries on the ground. Whereas Kareem Hunt, I mean, he's just been so efficient. Even if he doesn't see a lot of touches, he's still been very productive for fantasy. So you got to keep him in your lineup. Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry, we know that Washington is more prone to give up points through the air than they are through the ground. So it's kind of hard to talk myself out of benching either of these guys, especially if Landry has been trending in the right direction, healing up from that hip injury. And Odell Beckham, we saw last week, got open on multiple plays, did get that touchdown. Not expecting a massive game from either of these guys, but I think they definitely give you enough to warrant a start. And then the Browns defense is good as well with Haskins back there making a lot of still rookie mistakes. The Browns have a pretty good pass rush as well. Look for there to be a lot of sacks and some turnover potential here. We're not starting Hooper at all anymore. Like, Hooper is pretty much benched and probably drop worthy at this point until he actually shows us something. But apparently they paid him to use him as a blocker. So we're not using him for fantasy. And then there's no way I can trust Baker Mayfield against this defensive line. Just the downside for him is just too low. Overall, I think this game will be a closer one than Vegas is thinking. I think the Browns can still edge it out at home, but I do think that Washington will be able to cover that spread. We got the Browns winning 20 to Washington with 17. All right, let's jump over and talk about the Cincinnati Bengals and the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, if there was a game that isn't very interesting in fantasy, but is way more interesting in real life, probably more this one, although there are plenty of good fantasy plays here. 2 0-2 teams here with a lot of promise coming in. Joe Burrow looks legit, but he hasn't gotten his first win yet, whereas the Eagles, ever since that second quarter against Washington when Carson Wentz threw the interception near the end of the first half, they basically have been one of the worst, if not the worst team in the NFL on offense. They just have not looked good. Carson Wentz has just been straight up bad. So something's got to give here. Obviously, one of these teams are going to come away with a dub. Who's it going to be? Well, Vegas thinks it's the Eagles, but they're not ultra confident in it. 5-point spread here, over under a 46. So, middle to higher on the week. Implied point total here is the Eagles getting about 25.5 versus the Bengals 20.5. Now, the Bengals have not given up a lot of points to quarterbacks, but bear in mind they played Tyrod Taylor in week 1, who didn't really do anything. We saw the Bengals get absolutely torched by Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb last week. And, even though they've given up the 30th most points to receivers, we saw Odell Beckham have a nice day against them last week, moderate against the tight end, whereas the Eagles have actually been pretty average across the board. They've been okay at stopping the wide receivers. Again, in week 1, playing against Washington, there wasn't a lot going on for them offensively that game, whereas last week, we saw them kind of shut Robert Woods down, but Cooper Kupp had a nice game, so I'm not really buying that this team is a strong defensive team against the receivers. I think they're just kind of mediocre all around. Their run defense has not been what it used to be, at least from what we saw last year. And they're giving up a lot of points to tight ends as well. We just saw Tyler Higbee absolutely torch the Eagles last week and throw up 3 touchdowns. So what does that mean here? Well, we're going to start our studs. I mean, that should just be the norm from this point. I'm confident in Mixon. The Eagles' run defense does not look anywhere near as imposing as it used to be, and especially if they're getting a lot of good distance. If Carson Wentz continues his turnover bug, Mixon should have a much better chance at scoring in this one. Hopefully, get a couple scores for you. But I'm confident in Mixon. I haven't lost faith in him yet. He's looked decent. The offensive line has not. Hopefully, they can get a little bit more cohesion going on there. But Mixon involved a bit more in the passing game last week as well. Giovanni Bernard has been a bit of a pain for fantasy, but I think Mixon will have a better week this week. With Tyler Boyd, this game could end up being a higher scoring affair. Both of these defenses here kind of shaky. We're expecting both of these teams to at least be able to move the ball against one another. So Tyler Boyd could actually see a lot of work. We saw last week, he led the team in fantasy points. Didn't lead the team in targets. That was AJ Green. AJ Green has received some of the most targets and I believe the most air yards of any receiver in the NFL right now, but he has done very little with it. So that is my main concern with AJ Green right now, is at what point is he actually going to turn things around and look like AJ Green again? Because up to this point, he's really just looked stale. He definitely looks like a guy that hasn't been on the field in over a year. And the real question now is, does he turn it around, or is this just who he is? And if this is who he is, they're going to eventually pivot away from him. So I am comfortable starting him because of the amount of targets he's received in the red zone, the amount of high leverage targets he's gotten. Like, he was very close from having a phenomenal game last week if he would have been able to pull in like 2 or 3 of those catches that he just seemed to drop. So if at any point he turns things around in the middle of the game, you're going to regret benching him. This is kind of the last week for me. If Green can't put up anything against the Eagles, he's going to go on my bench until further notice. But I think you can start him one last time, because with the amount of work that he's getting, eventually something's got to break through for Green. And we'll learn this week whether or not Green is going to be doing anything this year. Burrow, I guess you could talk me into starting him just based on the kind of performances that the Eagles have given up to the quarterbacks thus far, but I feel like there's probably better options out there for you. And the Drew Sample is interesting. Like I mentioned before, we already saw Tyler Higbee throw up 3 touchdowns on the Eagles last week, so maybe Drew Sample is a good play for you this week. Probably not someone I'm jamming into my lineup unless I have to, but if you're in a deeper league, or you lost, I guess there weren't really many tight ends that went down this last week, but if you just haven't been happy with your tight end options, Drew Sample is an interesting play this week. And then we're not playing Bernard. We're not playing any of the other receiving options here because no one's getting consistent enough targets outside of Boyd and Green to really warrant looking at here. Now, on the Eagles side, Miles Sanders is pretty much the lone bright spot of this offense right now. He truly was a bell cow last week, and even in a game that they lost, was heavily involved, still had a really nice fantasy day. Like I mentioned before, we saw the Bengals get absolutely murdered by Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb last week. I'm looking forward to seeing what Miles Sanders does, firing him up in all formats. Great DFS play this week as well. Now with Jalen Reagor getting hurt, I think that just means that they're going to rely even more on their tight ends. So, of course, you're starting Ertz and Goddard. Like, that should just be a given at this point because they're pretty much the target leaders across the board, and it's been that way for a while, and it's probably going to remain that way. Eagles defense is interesting here. Playing at home, it definitely have the chance for Joe Burrow to make some rookie mistakes, but not someone you have to jam into your lineup. I just feel like they're probably pretty low owned right now. So if all the other good players are gone, they might be someone you can sneak off the waiver wire for free. There's no way I'm starting Carson Wentz until he shows us that he's gained his confidence back. I mean, at this point, we're on Jalen Hurts watts. So hopefully Carson Wentz can, rebound against the Bengals as Baker Mayfield did last week. We'll see. In terms of his receiving options, Deshaun Jackson could have a decent game, but he hasn't looked like himself. Greg Ward, probably not someone you really want to throw out there unless you're in like the deepest of leagues. I'm not playing Arcega-Whiteside. Alshon Jeffrey is still a few weeks from returning. We'll see whether Jalen Reagor comes back in 2 or 6 weeks. I've heard both reports at this point. So just kind of a mess outside of the running back and tight end situation there for the Eagles. And we're not playing Boston Scott. He was definitely just a sprinkle workload kind of guy. He was not seeing any significant touches last week. And in a game where Sanders was coming back from an injury, you thought maybe they'd ease him back into the workload. Not at all. He was truly the bell cow. So I'm going to give my vote of confidence here to the Eagles. I'm going to trust Vegas on this one, although I think that this game is a bit closer. I got the Eagles by 3, winning 28-25. So there should still be some fantasy goodness in this one. While there's probably going to be mistakes aplenty, I think that there's enough going on here where there's going to be some good fantasy options going. Okay, let's jump over and talk about the Las Vegas Raiders and the New England Patriots. Now, I have to admit to you guys, the Las Vegas Raiders really surprised me on Monday night. There's some bogus calls, some good warranted calls as well that went against the Saints that kept the Raiders on the field a little bit more than I would have thought they would have been, but they looked good. They were able to, just constantly feed Darren Waller. The Saints just had no answer for Darren Waller. And of course, Drew Brees, that's a story for the next stream that we do where we talk about the Saints game, but the Raiders overall looked a lot better than I expected them to be. Now, this is a game on the road. They're going against the Patriots, who the Patriots also look a lot better than a lot of people expected them to look in the preseason. So this is going to be a really, really, really good tell who these teams are. Because we've seen the Patriots, we saw them dominate the Dolphins and then turn around and play really strongly against the Seahawks. Barely lost that one. You have a better play call on that last goal line play with Cam Newton, and the Patriots would be 2-0. Whereas you have a 2-0 team in the Raiders that actually came out and beat the Saints. They beat both of their NFC opponents. Going on the road, what does this game look like? Going to be incredibly interesting. I have my take, and I might be wrong again, but we'll see. Patriots are slated to win this one by 6, giving us an implied point total of about 27-21 with that 47.5 over-under. Now, the Raiders have given up a lot of points to running backs, but that doesn't mean anything because they've faced Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey. And the Patriots have been pretty mediocre across the board in their defense. Obviously, last week, absolutely getting torched by Russell Wilson didn't really help matters much. So, again, we're taking a lot of these numbers with a grain of salt because we only have 2 data points, not really much to go off of there. What we do know is what we've seen with our eyes and what we've already observed. Cam is a baller, and maybe Derek Carr is as well. So let's talk about it. I still believe in the Patriots defense, especially at home. I don't expect the Raiders to put together as much of a fight in this one as they did against the Saints. I could be wrong, but overall, the only guys I'm comfortable starting with on Las Vegas' side is Josh Jacobs, because you have to. I mean, he'd still put up a decent amount of fantasy points in a tough matchup against the Saints. I think he put up about 12 or 13 in PPR. You'll take that. That's a good floor. Probably hoping for something like that again. Maybe he scores a touchdown on this one. And then Darren Waller, I mean, there's zero chance you're benching Darren Waller at this point, especially after the way he just absolutely won you your week on Monday night last week. So those guys are locked and loaded. You have to start them. I'm not comfortable with starting anyone else on this team, though. Henry Ruggs barely got used in the game against the Saints after being used all over the place against Carolina. We saw Bryan Edwards get a few more targets last week, but that still wasn't enough for a decent fantasy game. Hunter Renfrow barely did anything. We've seen Zay Jones used in the end zone. We've seen Nelson Aguilar get barely any targets, but he keeps scoring. I don't trust any of the receiving options here in Las Vegas until we start seeing some trends and consistency. Got to keep all of these guys on your bench. And there's no way I'm playing the Raiders defense versus Cam Newton. Even if the Raiders show up in this one, that just means it's going to be a higher scoring game. I'm just not touching that. On the Patriots side, we saw Cam Newton throw for over 400 yards last week. So anyone that thought that Cam Newton was washed and all he was going to be was just a running back, guy can still throw. And he actually has a pretty decent supporting cast here in New England that I don't think a lot of people expected. It's a different supporting cast than he's ever had before. But Edelman is really good. White is kind of coming in. Harry is kind of coming into his own. So definitely starting Newton, definitely starting Edelman. Those are the guys locked and loaded. Have to get them into your lineup no matter what. And the Patriots defense, I still like. Again, game at home. I don't expect the Raiders to put up as much of a fight here. I think the Patriots defense can still put together a nice showing for you. And we've historically seen that Bill Belichick will come back and fight really hard the week after a loss. So we'll see if that continues in the Cam Newton era. But I'm just not betting on the Raiders much at all at this point. Now, you could talk me into starting James White if he plays, but at this point he hasn't practiced. We know last week with the unfortunate situation with his parents, I mean, he might miss again, and I wouldn't hate him. I wouldn't blame him for it at all because that's a really brutal situation. So monitor that situation. James White may be out again. If that's the case, you might be able to talk me into flexing Rex Burkhead in the most desperate of situations if you lost both Barkley and Mostert and you weren't able to get any of the waiver wire pickups this week. Burkhead might be a sneaky flex for you. Whereas N'Keal Harry has continued to see his target share stay high, but he's only been okay with that. So if the Patriots just dominate this game from the start and the Raiders don't put up much fight, there's not going to be as much passing volume. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's not going to be anywhere near the passing volume that we saw last week. N'Keal Harry was still just an okay start. So I'm probably going to still hold off on pushing him into my lineup unless you've dealt with a lot of injuries. So that's why he's in my second guess column. Again, when start Burkhead if White is out potentially, but Michelle just has to stay on your bench. The guy is garbage at this point. It hasn't really looked good at all. I'm waiting for Damian Harris to come back. Hopefully Damian Harris is able to do something in this backfield. But I got the Patriots winning this one pretty decisively. I got the Patriots 28-17. We'll see if the Raiders put up a much bigger fight in this one. This will be the last time I disrespect them, I promise you. But let's see. Let's just see. All right. Let's jump over and talk about the Bears and the Falcons. Now, Bears are 2-0. Falcons are 0-2. And yet, the Falcons are still favored to win. And I get it. I understand. This is a weird game. High over-under for a game with the Bears. Bears typically have much lower over-unders because they're more defensive battles. But 47.5, I think, goes to show that Vegas just really trusts what Matt Ryan is slinging right now. And he's been really good. So our implied point total is roughly 25-22. Again, Falcons slated by 3. The Bears have been pretty good across the board with the exception of the tight end position, keeping quarterbacks, running backs, receivers in their place for fantasy, whereas the Falcons have been an absolute goldmine for opposing fantasy players. The Falcons are giving up the most points to the quarterback position, the 4th most to tight ends, 5th most to wide receivers, and 11th most to running backs. Again, similar thing that we've talked about in other previews. These are just 2 data points. The Falcons did play the Cowboys and the Seahawks, who are both very high potent offenses. So while I don't expect the Falcons defense to ever be really good this year, this may be a bit of data skew. So we'll keep that in mind. Obviously, we're not expecting Mitchell Trubisky to go out and throw 5 touchdowns. I hope I'm wrong. But yeah. So in terms of who we're starting this week, you could talk me into playing Mitchell Trubisky in DFS, but there's no way I'm going to trust him in my normal lineup. This just has the makings of a potential game where it just is flat. There isn't nearly as much offense as we were thinking. This could most certainly hit the under, and unless the Falcons defense truly is one of the worst in the league and the Bears can run all over them, I could definitely see this being like a game where the Bears just try to run the clock out with David Montgomery. I mean, Allen Robinson is a great start this week. The Falcons just have been very, very poor at defending receivers, and Allen Robinson has still been getting a ton of targets, even though he hasn't had a lot of fantasy production. So, got to trust him one more time. This is the week he turns things around, but there's really no one else on the Bears offense that I'm really trusting to throw out there. I mean, you can play it risky and play the Bears defense, but if the Falcons go off and score a ton of points, you're going to regret that one for sure. Anthony Miller last week gave you a goose egg, so he's not someone I'm dropping, but I'm not playing him at this point. Darnell Mooney had the touchdown, but he only had 3 targets on the day. Jimmy Graham, just Tariq Cohen is still super inefficient. We're not starting Cordero Patterson. So David Montgomery is a great play this week. Falcons have been, really poor at stopping the run. And then Allen Robinson, again, should be a really good play. I'm not trusting anyone else on the Bears. On the Falcons side, I mean, this one's pretty easy. Matt Ryan, we can't bench him until he shows us a reason to. I mean, he's done this to us every other year where he's had a phenomenal fantasy point total. He's had in 2016 and 2018, he was the number 2 quarterback on the year. Definitely looks like he's trying to do that again and has been really productive, although, and he hasn't really, I don't think he's thrown a single interception yet. No, he threw the one in the game against the Seahawks where it was just like a air it out at the end of the game. It was a meaningless throw. Other than that, Matt Ryan has been pretty, consistent. In years past, he's thrown a lot of interceptions, so that's a good trend. We'll see if that switches over when he plays a tougher defense like the Bears. But Matt Ryan, I still like this week. Fire him up. We'll see what the Bears can do. Of course, you're starting Calvin Ridley, the number 1 receiver in fantasy right now. Julio Jones dealing with that hamstring injury is a little bit concerning to me, but I feel like we've seen this song and dance with Julio Jones pretty much his entire career. Like, I don't really remember a season that he didn't pretty much live on the injury report and still managed to play through almost every single ailment he's had, unless it was like a true serious injury, like when he suffered that Jones fracture. So we'll see. Monitor tomorrow on Friday. This video will go up on Friday, so maybe by the time you hear this video, Julio Jones will have already either been ruled as practicing on Friday, or if he's out again, that might be a little bit more concerning. But even then, does Julio Jones really need to practice? He's been playing with Matt Ryan for so long at this point. He could still go even if he doesn't practice on Friday. So if Julio Jones is active, I'm playing him. That's a matter of fact. If he's out, then you can swap him with Russell Gage, which we'll get to in a second. And then we mentioned the Bears have been a little bit weaker at stopping the tight end, so I think Hayden Hurst is a good play this week. Now, Todd Gurley is someone that you probably don't have the luxury of benching, but he has not been good. He has been very inefficient. He has not been able to create a lot of missed tackles. He hasn't been able to do much with the work that he's been given, and he hasn't been giving the work that we were hoping for. Well, I guess I should take that back. He's had a decent bit of opportunities. He just hasn't really done anything from a fantasy perspective with it. So can he turn that around against the Bears with a decent front seven? If you have the luxury of being able to bench him, hopefully you had a guy like James Robinson and you were able to play him tonight. If you have the luxury, I would wait it out and see how this game goes, because this could be a bad situation for Gurley year round, but you're probably in this situation where you have to start him and then you're just going to pray that he scores a touchdown this week. Whereas Russell Gage has been incredibly interesting, 12 targets week 1, 9 targets week 2. And, we're not expecting there to be nearly as much pass volume in this one because the Bears are not the prolific offense that the Cowboys and the Seahawks are. So if Julio Jones plays, I'm probably going to hold off on playing the wide receiver 3 here. But if Julio Jones is out, and maybe you have both Julio Jones and Russell Gage, I think Russell Gage becomes a really nice start if Julio is out. So that's pretty much the only situation I'm really playing Gage, unless I'm in a super deep league. But I'm going to try to keep him off my lineup this week, because at some point that it's going to start polarizing. We've seen this a lot with teams like the Falcons, where there's, some weeks where other guys perform, but it never stays consistent. And at some point you get the 2 guys that rise to the top. And I think that will, of course, still be Julio and Ridley. And then I don't really think the Falcons really have a fantasy defense that anyone rosters, but you're definitely not starting them even against Mitchell Trubisky. Overall, I like the Falcons to win this one, edge the Bears out 27-24. So obviously I think there would be some points being scored in this one. I don't have a lot of confidence in this prediction either, because there's a lot of ambiguity here. Mitchell Trubisky has looked bad, but he's still managed to win 2 games, whereas Matt Ryan has looked good, but the defense has been so bad that they're 0-2, and that stupid onside kick that someone needs to be fired for. But can the Falcons pull this one out at home? I think they can, but I do think it will be a close battle. Okay, let's jump over and talk about the Los Angeles Rams and the Buffalo Bills. Now, this is a more interesting game on the week for sure. We have 2-0 teams here, and we're still trying to piece together who exactly these teams are. Now, the Bills have played the Dolphins and the Jets, so not exactly the most formidable of opponents, but they've dominated them, and that's what you would hope a good team to do. Well, I guess I shouldn't say they dominated the Dolphins. Technically, the Dolphins were pretty close to winning that game at the end, but the Bills were able to continue fighting, and they won. They made it look pretty decisive at the end, whereas the Rams, the Rams were able to beat the Cowboys and the Eagles, but do we really know that the Cowboys and Eagles are that great of teams at this point? The Cowboys barely beat the Falcons based on some really dumb luck, and the Eagles are 0-2. So we're not sure either of these teams who really is, if they're real or if they're just pretenders. So this should be a pretty good litmus test for both of these teams to see where they actually fit into the power rankings. Over-under for this one is 47, so Vegas is expecting a decent bit of scoring, and they're confused as much as we are. The Bills are only a -2 home favorite here, and I'm pretty much in agreement with that. I'm not really sure what to expect of either of these teams. So the Rams and the Bills have both been pretty good at slowing down quarterback production. Rams have allowed more running back production, whereas the Bills have allowed more tight end and receiver production. Again, 2 data points, not really a lot to go off there. So we'll move on past this point. Let's talk about who we're starting. I mean, you drafted Woods and Kupp early. They're still in the stud category, at least for another week. I know Cooper Kupp has been very disappointing. It's someone that we were avoiding anyway, but he's going to turn things around eventually. He is one of the most targeted guys in the red zone. Goff's favorite red zone target for years. And at some point, he's going to turn things around. Could be this week. Don't want him to be on my bench when that happens. We just saw the Miami Dolphins were able to torch the secondary, which doesn't make sense with Tre'Davious White there, but he's only one guy. So Cooper Kupp definitely could have a pretty good game in this one. Robert Woods as well. I'm not going to be benching either of these guys. I don't think either of them will get shadowed by Tre'Davious White. Now, Tyler Higbee is super interesting here because we just saw Mike Gesicki just go off against the Bills last week. And Tyler Higbee, after throwing up 3 touchdowns last week, probably not benching him anyway, but I'm definitely confident in starting him this week. And then, if this game ends up being a lower scoring affair, we know both of these teams are prone to commit some turnovers. I'm still comfortable starting both of the defenses in this one. And, there's not a lot of great defensive plays anyway. So these are the type of defenses that you can take a shot at. Jared Goff, I'd be a little bit more hesitant to play. He had a really poor fantasy outing in week 1. Pretty good outing last week. Again, we're not really sure to know what's going on with him. And then Darrell Henderson and Malcolm Brown. So it looks like Cam Akers is out. I'm pretty sure that's safe to say that at this point. Malcolm Brown looks like he's going to play, but how efficient is he going to be with a broken pinky? Darrell Henderson looked good last week, but the Bills' run defense has been pretty strong. Again, caveat, they haven't played any good running backs yet. And as we mentioned, Darrell Henderson had a really efficient last week against the Eagles. I'm still a little bit hesitant because I think Malcolm Brown might still get all the goal line carries here, and it might just make for a really annoying situation for both of them. So if you can avoid playing both of them, I would. But if I had to pick between one or the other, I would take Henderson. Van Jefferson and Josh Reynolds not getting nearly enough targets here to warrant throwing them into your lineup at this point. On the Bills side, you're still going to be starting Josh Allen. He started the season off red hot, one of the better starts that we've seen in the past decade. Hasn't thrown an interception yet, which is really good for Josh Allen. So we'll see if he can perform this well against a better pass defense like the Rams. But at this point, you're probably not benching Josh Allen. Stephon Diggs has been one of the best values thus far in drafts. And with Josh Allen going off by nature, Stephon Diggs has been going off with him, as has John Brown. Now, John Brown dealing with an injury right now, so make sure you monitor that injury report. If John Brown doesn't play, I would move Cole Beasley up into my low-end starts of the week. But I think John Brown will go based on just monitoring the injury reports. I think he's fine. And again, as we mentioned, I would be playing both defenses in this one if you don't have like a fantastic top tier option. On the running game, this one is a situation to monitor as well, because we know the Rams are prone to give up some points on the ground. We saw Ezekiel Elliott just absolutely destroy them week 1, and then Miles Sanders took care of them last week as well. Again, caveat, good running backs there. And Devin Singletary and Zach Moss have been a really, really annoying backfield up to this point. That being said, Zach Moss showed up on the injury report late this week. And sometimes, historically when that happens, that's normally not a good sign for their playing status heading into the week. So Zach Moss could be a scratch this week. And if he is, I think Devin Singletary becomes a much better start. Devin Singletary had a really good run of fantasy points last year when he was pretty much the only game in town. Once Frank Gore went down, he was actually seeing a significant amount of touches on the day. So if Zach Moss is gone, I'm much more confident throwing Singletary into my lineup. But if Zach Moss is active, I'm probably trying to avoid both guys here. We're not starting Gabriel Davis, and we're not starting Tyler Kroft with Dawson Knox out. So I think this game will be close. I like the Rams slightly here, even on the road. I just don't quite believe in the Bills yet. I want to see them do it against a real team before I have faith in them. Playing the Dolphins and Jets and could have lost that game to the Dolphins. We'll see. But again, the Rams haven't really faced anyone that tough yet either. So this game will be very telling. But if I had to put money on it, I would go with the Rams taking down the Bills 24-21. All right. We now jump over to the Houston Texans and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Pittsburgh Steelers, one of the better defenses on the year, and the Texans starting 0-2, which I feel like that one was pretty much a given. Bill O'Brien has found a way to just keep moving the talent off of this roster, and I feel bad for Deshaun Watson because at this point, I just don't believe that the Texans are a very good team. But the Steelers, I've been watching them for a while. The Steelers do have a way of losing to teams that they shouldn't, so let's not count the Texans out just yet. Steelers are slated to win this one by 4. We got a 45 over-under, giving us an implied point total of 24.5 for the Steelers and 20.5 for the Texans. Again, a lot of the early games are coming here right around the 45 points over-under. Now, the Texans have given up a lot of points to running backs. We saw last week, Mark Ingram, Gus Edwards, and J.K. Dobbins were just able to run all over them. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had that great game in week 1. They really haven't been that great in any area on defense, whereas the Steelers had been pretty stifling on the ground, pretty stifling against quarterbacks, okay against receivers. We saw Darius Slayton go off against them in week 1, but last week, not really much to speak of with the Broncos. So tough defense here, playing in Pittsburgh. It's going to make it really hard to trust anyone on the Texans side, especially when we talk about the receivers. So David Johnson, again, similar situation to Todd Gurley. You're probably not in the luxury to bench him, and he gets enough looks in the passing game, hoping for a touchdown. He still has looked good. I'm so comfortable starting him even in a tougher matchup here. He's probably not going to have the ceiling that he did in week 1, but he could still break off a nice run for you. Start David Johnson, and hopefully it works out for you. Now, I'm leaning... This one's tough because Will Fuller is not on the injury report, but we saw how ineffective he was. He totally goosed you last week. He was on the sideline dealing with this hamstring for a portion of the game, and we know what Will Fuller does when he starts dealing with a soft tissue injury. It typically takes him a while to come back to full strength. So last week, Brandon Cooks was the target leader. He looked good in that role. I'm going to have more confidence in Brandon Cooks this week than I do in Will Fuller. Will Fuller, I am just hesitant, especially against this tough Steelers defense. If he is dealing with a hamstring already, probably going to try to find a way to keep him on my bench. Randall Cobb, you could make an argument for, but I think this is going to be a lower volume game against the Steelers, so probably not going to be throwing in Cobb or any of the tight ends here. And again, same situation we had last week. Deshaun Watson, was not a good play last week against the Ravens, and he didn't produce for fantasy. This is, again, not a good situation to be starting Deshaun Watson. Hopefully you were able to pick up a guy like Ryan Tannehill or Ryan Fitzpatrick up this week, but Deshaun Watson ends up being someone that I'm trying to pivot off of Doesn't mean he's going to do terrible. Again, I've mentioned the Steelers do find a way to let teams win when they shouldn't, but I'm just not bent on Deshaun Watson until we see it or he has a decent matchup here. Duke Johnson still might be hurt, might not play this week, but even if he was, he's staying on our bench. Kenny Stills hasn't really done anything, and of course we're not starting the Texans defense against that Ben Roethlisberger hot offense for the Steelers. Roethlisberger's a great play this week. Of course you're starting him. Juju is dealing with a knee injury, but report today was that even though he missed practice on Thursday, that he's still trending very much to play. So I'm going to take that at its word. Obviously, pay attention to the practice report on Friday. But if Juju practices on Friday, I think he's in. He's a great play this week. Deontay Johnson, the target leader on this team, definitely a good play. Connor is the interesting one. Obviously, he's a good play because the Texans are really bad against the run. And Connor looked good last week, so you're probably going to keep playing him until he gets hurt again. And just pray that he doesn't get hurt again. But, I mean, we kind of knew that going into this. So hopefully you're able to use this bounce back week for Connor to go out and get Snell, because if Connor goes down again, we've seen that Snell is going to get a good bit of work. So keep Snell rostered on the back of your bench, but Connor is a good play this week. I don't trust Eric Ebron. He hasn't done anything yet. Chase Claypool was an interesting guy at this point. He's looking kind of like the replacement for what they wanted Martavis Bryant to be all those years ago. So I can understand in like a super deep league people thinking about throwing him in there, but he is seeing nowhere near the level of targets yet to really warrant a fantasy start. You're basically hoping for like a Mecole Hardman type game where he gets like that 180-yard pass for a touchdown, and that's not going to come every week, so I'm not going to take that chance. I think the Steelers win this one pretty easily. I got the Steelers winning this one 24 to the Texans, who are scoring 15. So covering the spread and hitting the under on the week. All right, and let's jump over to the last game on the early game slate, the Tennessee Titans versus the Minnesota Vikings. This is going to be a very telling game for the Vikings. So I know a lot of people are in absolute panic mode after what the Vikings put up, the garbage showing that they put up last week against the Colts. Kirk Cousins had a negative fantasy point game, 3 interceptions, no touchdowns. Dalvin Cook was literally the only bright spot on that team. Anthony Barr went down with a season-ending injury. So this defense is already bad, and now it's decimated even more. Whereas the Titans, their offense has been hot. They've looked great on offense. Derrick Henry still getting going. This is kind of his MO up to this point. Derrick Henry plays great in the end of the season, but the start, he looks all right, but he's just not breaking those long runs quite yet. But Tannehill still looks just as efficient as ever, has scored 20 or more fantasy points, I believe, for like 12 or 13 weeks straight. I can't remember the exact streak, but he's just been killing it. So coming to this situation where last week the Titans, barely beat the Jaguars and they barely beat the Broncos. So their defense has been a bend but don't break type defense versus the Vikings, who just absolutely choked last week. I think this is going to be a very telling game as to whether or not the Vikings are going to have anything going for them this week. I still have faith. I think their defense is garbage and it will remain garbage, but I think Kirk Cousins just had a bad game and they will rebound. Going against the Titans, again, not the most imposing defense right now. I think this will be a higher scoring game. And Vegas agrees. Vegas has this as a 49-point over-under. They do favor the Titans on the road by 2.5 points, but that's a very small margin. So keep that in mind as everyone is panicking about the Vikings. Vegas is like, this is pretty close to a toss-up. Implied points, 26-23 roughly for the Titans over the Vikings. As I mentioned, the Titans have been pretty average across the board, giving up 20th most points to quarterbacks, 14th to running backs, 16th to receivers, and 7th to tight ends, whereas the Vikings have been the second best team to play receivers against and have been top 12, top 13 for quarterbacks and running backs. So there should be a lot of fantasy points scored in this game if it goes according to plan, and I think that it will. I think the Vikings will be able to stick with the Titans in this one. I'm hoping for a lot of points to be scored. I think this is a sneaky shootout type game that a lot of people are scared of because of Kirk Cousins. And sometimes those are the best money makers in DFS, the games that people pivot off of and you get those low ownership totals. Obviously, we're going to be starting the studs in this game. Doesn't mean we're going to be pivoting to anyone else, but I'm expecting some good fantasy production from this game. So Ryan Tannehill is one of my favorite starts this week. Obviously, last week, Phillip Rivers didn't need to do too much, so he didn't have a great fantasy game, but we saw Aaron Rodgers absolutely torch the Vikings in week 1. Again, this game is in Minnesota, so I think that the Vikings have a little bit better shot at keeping up with this one. So Tannehill is a great start. Of course, you're starting Derrick Henry. His touchdowns will come. Just got to be patient. It's looking like A.J. Brown is going to miss, so I think that makes Corey Davis a pretty good start. And, of course, you're starting Jonnu Smith. We saw Mo Alley-Cox destroy the Vikings last week, which, I mean, people knew of that name, but he wasn't on anyone's radar last week when Jack Doyle missed. So Mo Alley-Cox, he would have put up a bunch of points against him. You can only imagine what Jonnu Smith is going to be able to do. Adam Humphries is an interesting name in a deeper league. I could see myself flexing him, but not someone I'm trying to jam into my lineup. We're not starting Anthony Firkser or the Titans defense is interesting. I know a lot of people are on them this week, but we were on them last week and they really sucked against the Jaguars. So, other than a couple of turnovers, giving up 30 points is not what you want from a defense, especially going on the road. I mean, you're basically banking that the Vikings are just in complete full implosion mode, but I think they rebound. So I'm trying to avoid the Titans defense this week. On the Vikings side, of course, you're starting Dalvin Cook, and I think Adam Thielen has a massive rebound game this week. We saw he was one of the best receivers in week 1 and he barely did anything last week by nature of Kirk Cousins just absolutely sucking. I'm saying nice things about the Vikings. It's not like I'm going out and starting Kirk Cousins. Like, you have a better option. Just play the better option, but hope that he's able to produce enough to give you a good game for Cook and Thielen and enough to keep the Titans offense engaged so that you get a good point total from them as well. Alexander Madison, an absolute desperate play. Like, if you lost a couple running backs this week and you just need a flex, you could definitely do it. He scored 14 points in week 1 in PPR, but barely anything last week. So try to avoid it if you can. I don't trust any of the other pass catchers here because it's getting spread around. It's pretty much like 50% Thielen and Cook, and everyone else just gets a very small piece of an already small passing pie. So until Jefferson breaks out or Olabisi Johnson takes a step forward or one of these tight ends starts, edging the other one out, I'm not touching anyone else here. I'm just hoping for a higher scoring game where Cook, Thielen, Tannehill, Henry, Corey Davis, and Jonnu Smith are feasting on a lot of points. So I think the Titans win this one. I got them winning 31-25, but obviously I'm expecting this game to be a bit higher in the point total, and I think that will create some really good fantasy days for the players that you're starting in this game. And that is it for the early game slate. We'll come back and actually do another stream tonight. We normally do the early game slate stream on Wednesday night, but we'll do this one. We'll do the late game now as well, so we're on track. Post all these videos tomorrow, so if you joined the stream late and wanted to go back and hear any of these, just hit that subscribe button, hit the bell. We'll we'll chop these up and load them up tomorrow, and that's it. So thank you guys for joining. I do appreciate it. Hope you had a really good Thursday and Good Friday. Have a happy Friday and a happy weekend. We'll see you guys in the next video.